Hi, thank you. So we just heard from some movement leaders about some of the biggest problems affecting this country, and now I want to talk a little bit about how we get big progressive ideas through Congress, if we can get them through Congress. And we're having a little change in schedule, so I am joined right now by Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon. He is the author of the Equality Act, which recently passed the House. And he's been leading the effort to bring attention to the cruel treatment of migrant children being held in detention at the border. So we are also going to be joined later, I believe, by Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, who is rushing here from Washington because votes were delayed. And so she took a later train. She is on her way here. So when she comes, she'll be joining us on stage. So I wanted to start a little bit on something that recently happened in Congress where I think progressives should have had more power than they did. And it showed sort of, I think, some of the struggles in getting progressive priorities passed. And this is the aid for the migrant crisis at the border. And I'm going to summarize it really briefly for those of you who weren't following the ins and outs of what Congress is doing. Basically, the House passed a more liberal version of legislation giving aid, and it had some restrictions on how Trump could spend it on his enforcement agenda, and it provided protections for migrants. The Senate then passed a version, it's obviously controlled by Republicans. It was less liberal, but the idea was that it would then go back to the House, they would go to conference, and some of those more liberal provisions would get added. Instead, the House simply passed the more conservative Senate version. And the rub is that most Democrats in the Senate voted for the more conservative version. Senator Jeff Merkley was not one of those who voted for it. He voted against it. So I wanted to talk to you, Senator, a little bit about why you voted against it, why so many of your colleagues voted for it, and just what happened.
I want to say a word first about the underlying issue, which was a year ago, June, that I went down to find out what was going on with this, quote, zero tolerance policy that sounded like the administration was going to rip children out of their parents' arms. And I went to that processing center in McAllen, and nobody had been in there yet. I went in and I saw those chain link cages with boys separated here and girls and fathers and mothers. And my God, this is not America that we treat refugees in this fashion as criminals. We need to stand up for the fundamental value of treating people with respect and decency in our country. I mean, we're talking about children blockaded at the border, left stranded in Mexico. We're talking about children put in ice-cold holding cells. We're talking about children ripped out of their parents' arms. We're talking about children without hygiene, without 3 meals a day, without the basics of having darkness at night so they can sleep. We're talking about a child prison industry in which a for-profit is being paid $750 a day to lock up children in Homestead, Florida. All of this is wrong and against the fundamental values of America, and we have to come together and put an end to it. That's the underlying position. So in the Senate, we tried to get some protections in, and Pat Leahy, the head of the Spending Committee, Appropriations Committee, did the best he could with the Republicans in control. But the whole conversation all along was the House will do far better and we'll go to conference and we will win a number of those features. And a whole series of things that, by the way, 40 senators yesterday endorsed and introduced my bill, which is End the Cruelty to Migrant Children Act. We want that act passed, and it's not going to pass first in the Senate, it's got to pass first in the House. So here's the situation that was so frustrating, is the House on this spending bill, they didn't go to conference. So we lost all the leverage that the progressives, like Congresswoman Jayapal, had worked so hard to get. It just went down the tube. And so that's, we cannot let that happen. The House has to carry its weight to restore the values of America. It failed on this occasion. That's very frustrating, but let's take it a lesson and not let it happen again.
So whose fault was it that it didn't go to conference? Is it Speaker Pelosi? Is it the moderates in the House? What happened there?
So I'm observing from a distance, not being a member of the House, but the complete assumption on the Senate side was that Speaker Pelosi would take it to conference, and she didn't. And she is the leadership, so that's where the responsibility rests.
Do you think that her hand would have been strengthened against the moderates in her caucus if so many Democratic senators hadn't voted for it?
So I think it's a fair point. Perhaps, but the product of the Senate is a Republican-led product, not a Democratic-led product. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on that side of the coin.
And tell me a little bit about why you voted against it specifically. You know, you mentioned that Pat Leahy fought for protections, but why did you still vote against it?
So as I just shared with you, there's these multiple ways that refugees are being mistreated, that children are being mistreated. And so I wanted to say funding that goes to this administration, we cannot trust they will spend it in the right ways. We need, in the law, deliberate protections to stop the for-profit prison system. We need to be able to shut down the tornillos in homesteads. We need to be able to stop child separation by law. We need to stop the blockade at the border by law. Those are the things that need to be in the bill as well.
So I'll ask Congresswoman Jayapal more about this when she arrives, but I wanted to turn now to the Senate. What power can Democrats wield in the Senate, even though you're in the minority? Do you think Democrats are doing it effectively, or are there big structural barriers that simply you have no power?
So I have a kind of a mission statement for the next 16 months, and it does involve the Senate, but it goes like this. Dump Trump, ditch Mitch, save America. That's our mission. What Mitch McConnell has done as majority leader is take all the power onto himself, putting his amendment in front of all others, which has been a tradition in the Senate, but a tradition that then is taken down so others people can amend. He has not done that. He has blockaded all the amendments, controlled all the bills coming to the floor. So essentially, the Senate is deeply frozen. What it has become is simply a court-packing session in which Mitch is putting up one right-wing crazy judge after another, packing the district courts, packing the circuit courts with people who do not believe in the we the people vision of our Constitution. And this is horrendous. So can we stop that right now? We can't stop it right now under the rules of the Senate, which is why we have to take control of the Senate and the presidency in the November election next year.
So say that Democrats take control of the Senate. Are there rule changes that you would like to see done?
All right, let's talk about the dysfunction of the Senate. In the Continental Congress, they had a supermajority requirement, and it paralyzed the Continental Congress. So they didn't put a supermajority into the Constitution for legislative bodies. Quite the opposite. Hamilton and the Federalist Papers raged against the problem of a minority being able to exercise a veto over legislative activity. And what do we have now in the Senate? We have a veto by the minority over bills coming out of the Senate. And the result is that let me back up a little bit and say what the Republicans did, their agenda was to do tax reductions for the rich and powerful of the country. So in 2001, they brought in a new parliamentarian, and they proceeded to take a measure called reconciliation. It's a budget process that allowed you to use a simple majority to decrease the deficit. And they stood it on its head and said, now we can use that. So they changed the rules to expand the deficit, which meant giving tax breaks to the wealthiest Americans. Republicans established a simple majority pathway for their agenda for the powerful. We need a simple majority pathway for the we people agenda of healthcare, housing, education, living wage, jobs, carbon pollution, and equality.
So I think there's been some frustration amongst activists that Democrats could be doing more, say, to stop Trump's judges. I mean, obviously you don't have a majority, but it seems that Democrats at times have agreed, we'll pass this number of judges and then we can all go home for recess. So, do you think that again, I know that there's not a lot you can do in the minority, but is there more that you feel like Democrats could be doing?
So there's something called the nuclear option, which is you change a rule by interpretation of the parliamentarian, or you overturn the ruling of the chair in interpretation by simple majority. What Mitch McConnell did a few months ago is he overturned the time period required to debate judges and reduced it to 2 hours. And the result is he can do a judge every 2 hours for basically 4 a day. Why did he do this? Because we were slowing him way down. We were using the rules of the Senate to slow it way down. So he retaliated with the nuclear option. The nuclear option, many people have been nervous about using it. The fact is, it wasn't even front page news. If Mitch McConnell is going to use a nuclear option for the powerful and to pack the courts, let's use the nuclear option for the people of the United States of America and be able to pass legislation by simple majority. In fact, I would put it this way. When the presidential candidates come before you in the coming year, they're going to talk about all kinds of things they want to do on health care, on housing, on education, on living wage jobs, on equality, on carbon. So important. And the question is, well, the Republicans changed the rules to pass their agenda in the Senate by simple majority. Are you going champion passing your agenda by simple majority? Will the Democrats be as gutsy and determined as the Republicans were to get their agenda passed? And the answer better be yes, or they shouldn't be on the presidential stage.
So you'd like a Democratic Senate leader who, do you want to see Democrats essentially act more like Mitch McConnell?
When you put it that way. In terms of using power for the people, it's the exact opposite of Mitch McConnell. He's using power for the powerful, accelerating income inequality and wealth inequality, making it that much more difficult for people to get ahead. We heard that next Thursday there's going to be a vote in the House of Representatives to end the sub-minimum wage, right? Saru just talked about it. How is that going to get through the Senate? Right now, it'd be impossible to do that because the powerful control the Senate. That has to end. We have to fight to restore America and put it back on track with the vision it was intended with.
So we now have Congresswoman Jayapal here, so I'd like to welcome her out.
Great.
Hi. We're so glad you could make it. Thank you for rushing. We're sorry the House votes delayed you, but we're glad you're here. Congresswoman Jayapal is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and she is the lead sponsor of Medicare for All in the House. So I wanted to bring you into a discussion that we were having about the border supplemental and the funding for the migrant crisis. And we were talking a little bit about what happened, the breakdown. So I'd like to talk to you and get your perspective on this. What happened? Why did the House simply pass the Senate version and not go to conference?
Well, first of all, hello, Netroots Nation. I'm so excited to be here and with this champion as well. And I'm sorry I'm late, but we had to vote. So here I am. In terms of what happened, let me just take you chronologically quickly through a very short timeline, which was a week ago Thursday, we got the emergency supplemental bill. And because an emergency supplemental doesn't have to go through any committee process, it is just drafted primarily by leadership of the appropriations committees. Nobody had seen it. So literally the first time I saw the text was a week ago Thursday. I guess it would be 2 weeks ago yesterday now. And when I looked at it, it became very clear that it did not have accountability built into it. And I have been a skeptic of continuing to give more money to an agency that does not meet the conditions that we require them to meet. And an agency that, frankly, no matter how much money we give, this administration is trading in cruelty, number one, and number two, getting money to for-profit contractors that benefit off of caging children. And so when we looked at this, we realized that it had none of that accountability. We called an emergency progressive caucus call on Sunday that had over 4 dozen of our members on the phone. The CHC the night before called an emergency call of their members, and working together, the CHC and the CPC put together a list of 6 things that we thought, if we were able to get into the border supplemental bill, would at least allow us to have that accountability, and not just for this bill, but actually for the 2020 appropriations bill as well, which is very, very important. We need to start building in accountability. And so I will tell you, the first answer was no, second answer was no, the third answer was no. By the time we got to the 7th or 8th answer, we were actually able to withhold enough votes, and we are training our Progressive Caucus members to not say no or yes to a bill until we get what we want, or at least some of what we want, into that bill. And so we were able to do that, which meant that the bill wouldn't have enough votes to pass. We knew we weren't going to get Republican votes for our bill. And so doing that, we were then able to finally, it went until the very last minute on Tuesday, somewhere around 4 o'clock, came to an agreement around 2 very important provisions. Number one, that there is no waiving of conditions for these children. There are basic standards that have to be met: food and water, medical care. Who would have thought we need to write this stuff down? But we had to write it down because in the Senate bill it said that you could waive those conditions for up to 12 months. Totally unacceptable. And so we said, number one, these are the conditions you cannot waive. And number two, this is something I have been, as an immigrant rights activist, trying to get for over 20 years now, using money as a lever, as a hammer, that if you do not meet the conditions that are laid out, and we said within 6 months, that you get your money blocked. You do not have a contract anymore. You cannot bid on a contract anymore. You should not have that, okay? Which is super important. Now, I have a whole nother bill that deals with getting rid of these for-profit facilities, period. So that's a different thing. So we were able to get those in. We were able to get not holding kids for more than 90 days, I think. That felt to me too long. But anyway, we were able to get some things in. We brought it to the floor for a vote. It passed overwhelmingly. It went to the Senate. The Senate voted it down. The Senate then voted their bill, sent it back to us on Tuesday night. The Senate bill passed. Senator Merkley was a champion, and one of, was it 4 people who didn't vote, or 8 people handful of people who didn't vote for the Senate bill. But unfortunately, it passed with overwhelmingly bipartisan support, 84 bipartisan votes in the Senate. And so when that happened, a bunch of our conservative Democrats and moderate Democrats said, hey, the Senate just passed a really bipartisan bill. Why are we screwing around with these changes? Why don't we just pass the Senate bill? We were on the House floor for the vote for the rule for our amended Senate bill. We took the Senate bill, we added our provisions into the Senate bill, not all of them, but enough to still make it worthwhile. We were about to bring that bill to the floor for a vote. We were voting on the rule, and we were told that there were enough Democrats who were not going to vote for that bill and wanted to just vote on the Senate bill. And theoretically, it was because the Senate was not going to budge and the White House was not going to budge on any of these conditions. But my belief is we got to fight. We got to fight hard. And we cannot accept no when we have divided chambers. And we also can't have the Senate passing these big bipartisan votes because it affects what happens in the House. And so you saw that I said some things about some of my Senate Democratic colleagues, and I've had some good conversations since then. But listen, we have to make sure that we have a spine and that we keep a spine and that we push for the things that we really believe in. And if at the end we lose, then at least we lose fighting. But we should not allow this to go down. And so that is the story. In the end, there weren't the votes even for our amendment to the Senate bill, and they put up the Senate bill as it was. There were over 100. We whipped a no. The Progressive Caucus whipped a no on that bill, and there were over 100 votes against that Senate bill, but it passed because most of the Republicans voted for it.
Can I throw in a question here? Because perhaps I misled people, because I tell you a little bit of this perspective from the Senate side. was the viewpoint that the chair, the ranking member of the Senate appropriations, got what he could out of a Republican-led Senate, but that planning was underway to fight with you all in conference. And so I was personally extraordinarily disappointed that the House didn't say, fine, you passed your bill, we passed ours, let's go to conference, because I think there's where we might have had leverage to get what you're talking about.
That's what we were told as well, that the idea was, well, the first idea, which I knew was a pipe dream, but I like pipe dreams sometimes, was that the Senate would take up our bill, which I didn't think was going to happen. I thought we were going to have a conference. But when we had, two things happened. When the Senate voted in a big bipartisan way to pass the Senate bill, it made it easy for those who didn't want some of the provisions we had put into our bill, including not funding of ICE and the $17 billion for HSI, that's Homeland Security Investigations, which is not being used for what it's supposed to be used for, it's being used for deportation. Then that, in particular, that provision, people did not want to exclude that money. And so it gave leeway, it allowed for some of our more conservative Democrats to say, why should we vote for this bill when our senators voted for that bill? And I have talked to some of my Senate colleagues and explained this dynamic, and I think hopefully we'll have a different way to approach this for the future, because I hope that my good Senate Democratic colleagues will understand that a big bipartisan vote in the Senate takes away our leverage in the House. We lose the ability for some of our members to be able to hold when their senators are voting for something.
Senator Merkley, do you think that senators were aware of this dynamic, and was Senator Schumer telling members to not vote against it for this reason, or did he allow them to?
I don't know. I don't think it was a case of the minority leader, Schumer, instructing people how to vote. But there was extensive discussion among the leaders of the Appropriations Committee that they got the best deal that they could, but that they would be working with the House to improve it in conference. And so that promise of conference probably contributed to the dynamic. But it's good to have that sense of how the Senate and House Democrats have to work together, because what happened is the Republicans got a very bad bill with no accountability, and that's just a horrendous outcome.
Can I just add, too, that I have spoken to Senator Schumer since this all happened, and we had a great conversation. And one good thing I think that will come out of this, because, Senator Merkley doesn't have all of his progressive colleagues right there, because there's a presidential race going on. So there are a lot of people that aren't in the Senate who have traditionally been some of our champions there, so that there's more. And one really good thing that's come out of this is, I think the Progressive Caucus in the House and Senator Schumer and our progressives who are there will coordinate more closely going forward. And so I think that was something really good that came out of this. And Senator Schumer is coming to talk to the Progressive Caucus next week, I think. And so we are really trying to develop that relationship and make sure we're working together for the goals that all Democrats have.
So another thing that I took away from this was that it seems like conservatives in the House, conservative Democrats, have perhaps more power than people thought they may. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the dynamics between the conservatives, the speaker, and progressives. And I'm sure most people know, but Nancy Pelosi said of your colleagues, Tlaib, Omar, and Ocasio-Cortez, all these people have their public whatever in their Twitter world, but they don't have any following. So I wanted to get your thoughts on, what is the speaker doing? Why is she singling out these progressive women like this?
Let me go to the bigger question of progressive power, because honestly, I don't think you can just look at this, right? So we have been working very hard to leverage political power inside Congress. I'm an organizer and an activist. I believe that it all comes down to votes, whether you're on the outside or the inside. You've got to be able to leverage the votes. And there were lots of reasons infrastructurally why the Progressive Caucus in the House hasn't had the kind of power that it should have. And we should talk about what we're doing to fix that. But what that means is, there are choices that you make, whether it's as an activist on the outside or an activist on the inside. If you say you're going to vote no on something and you stick to voting no, you have less leverage to push some of the changes that you need through. But in the end, the power of how many votes you can garnish for whatever position you're pushing for is what is really important. So I think what Pelosi was talking about was that if you only have 4 votes in the House, that you can't get what you want done. Now, I have said publicly, I don't typically find Pelosi to be somebody who disrespects members. I've never felt disrespected as a woman of color by Nancy Pelosi. I don't think those comments were helpful to a broader picture of how we build progressive power in the House and what it looks like relative to overall Democratic power. All of that said, we have been remarkably successful in what we've been able to do with the Progressive Caucus in the House. We got, for the first time, we got equal representation on major committees, all of the A committees. That means financial services. When you see Katie Porter and Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on that committee, we negotiated that. That has never happened before. We negotiated at the beginning of the session for 40% representation on those committees. That means Jimmy Gomez, who just introduced Bernie Sanders' estate tax repeal, is now on Ways and Means. That has never been introduced by a Ways and Means member. It meant that we were able to get Medicare for All hearings in the Budget Committee, in the Rules Committee, and in the Ways and Means Committee, and hopefully now in the Energy and Commerce Committee. So part of this is how do you leverage a block of votes sufficient to get the power that you need? And then what's the other infrastructure you need? And I hope we get to talk about the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center and the Congressional Progressive Caucus Action Fund that Mark Pocan and I helped establish to really help coordinate research, organizing, communications, so that it helps move progressive priorities.
So I think there's been some frustration amongst activists that it seemed like at times Pelosi has been sidelining progressive priorities like the Green New Deal, impeachment, Medicare for All, and she's used terms, I think she described some of them as enthusiasms. At what do you feel like the speaker has sidelined progressive priorities? And at what point, if any, do you think that progressives should start acting like conservatives did toward John Boehner?
I don't want to act like conservatives did towards John Boehner. God, we have higher goals than that, don't we? But I know what you mean. Look, we brought down the budget caps deal because we did not want to vote for a huge defense spending number. Now, we still got rolled in the end because in the end, we're only 40% of the Democratic caucus. So people just have to understand that that's where it is. And you're in a majority, so it's very different than operating in a minority. Nancy Pelosi is going to respond to where her caucus is. And we do not have everybody in the caucus believing that our progressive priorities, my Medicare for All bill, Senator Sanders' Medicare for All bill, canceling debt, college debt, $1.6 trillion in college debt, Ilhan Omar's bill with Bernie, Elizabeth Warren's anti-corruption bill, we have not gotten to the place where we have 218 votes for that. And Nancy Pelosi is a vote counter, if nothing else. And she is a master strategist. And so she's not going to go there unless we are able to build the pressure for it. However, she is a negotiator. And to get Medicare for All hearings for the first time in the history of the country, of Congress, to be able to have 3 hearings in less than 3 months, is pretty phenomenal. That would not have happened had she not okayed it. Now, if I want to get a vote on Medicare for All, I need to show that I've got 218 votes, because it's not going to go to the floor if it doesn't have 218 votes. And so I think it is, nothing comes easy, no fight comes easy, and I don't think we should expect that that's the case. I think we are progressives because we are fighters, and we believe in a different vision than what is in front of us, and we believe we push to make that happen. Nobody brings us that on a silver platter and hands it to us. You got to fight, and you got to show that you have power, but the power can't just be on the outside. We have to get people on the inside to catch up to the people of the United States of America who know that these progressive priorities are the right priorities going forward.
And Senator Merkley, I know you're in another chamber, but I didn't know if you wanted to comment at all on what's going on in the House, the treatment of progressives, and I know you've had some thoughts about impeachment specifically.
Well, what can't happen in the House is for it to become routine to pass bills with a combination of Republicans and conservative Democrats. That will totally undercut everything that you're trying to do. And so that's a piece I'm concerned about. And on impeachment specifically, before when I was asked, I would say, well, let's see what the Mueller report is going to say, because that's going to tell us what the president really did. Well, 1,000, actually more than 1,000 former federal prosecutors have written to us and said anyone who did the things described in the Mueller report would be indicted. That's powerful, because above the doors of the Supreme Court is carved in equal justice under law. Now, I know we fall short of that all the time, but it's a core principle we strive towards. In fact, my first political act was when Spiro Agnew was convicted of bribery, taking $100,000 in bribes, and his penalty was $10,000. He got to keep 90% of the proceeds. So I'm a junior in high school. I'm a blue-collar kid. I come home and read the blue-collar newspaper, and I read this and go, are you kidding me? That's what justice is for the powerful? They get to keep 90% of the money they steal? And so I wrote to the newspaper, and they printed it, and so that was my first political act. And I look out of the Johnson room, and of course, President Johnson, when he was a majority leader, he had his office looking out at the Supreme Court at those four words, equal justice under law. And a lot of the work that was done for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act was done in that room. And that is where we launched the Equality Act in 2015, which the House has passed, and now the Senate has to pass it. And by the way, the House has passed H.R. 1, which is to end gerrymandering, voter suppression, and dark money. In the Senate, that's the For the People Act that Tom Udall and I have been leading, and we have to get that done if we're going to restore we the people democracy. So when I think about this impeachment question, it's this. If we do not proceed after 1,000 prosecutors say the president violated in the law that anyone else would be indicted, if we don't proceed to act in the House and hold him accountable, then we are allowing a major institution to crumble, and that's why I'm saying the House has to act on impeachment.
Do you think that we're running out of time for impeachment? Do you think that we're running out of time for impeachment?
I am worried about it being a conversation that carries us on into the primaries of next year. So I think the time is now. The time is to now, and not try to say there's 1,000 charges and let's explore every nuance, but there are things that have already been clearly laid out in the Mueller report. And so I'd like to see the House take up a limited set of those and hold a vote and decide if they're going to hold the president accountable. Send it over to the Senate. Now, I understand that the Republican leadership of the Senate may not take it up. And if there is a trial in the Senate, which there absolutely should be, we may not win the trial. It takes a supermajority. But I just feel it's a moral obligation and such an important foundation for our nation. We cannot allow a president to romp all over the law and simply walk away. Unacceptable.
So I wanted to ask a little bit about Medicare for All, which I know you both support. So
Can I just say a quick thing
please.
on
Yeah.
impeachment, because I'm on judiciary. And so I was one of the first Democrats in the House to come out for impeachment inquiry. I was on the impeachment articles last session. And I really believe that it's easy to look at this fearing what might happen if we go forward with impeachment, but I think that is totally the wrong approach. I actually think we have to flip that. And we have to actually be looking at what happens if we do not move forward.
Amen. Amen.
I think that's really important, because there's some perception out there that somehow it's safer for us not to move forward. And I have now read the Mueller report 3 times, because I am on Judiciary Committee, today in Judiciary, we had a set of legal scholars talking about remedies for high crimes and misdemeanors. It isn't just, there are lots of ways, by the way, to begin an impeachment inquiry or a set of proceedings around impeachment, including not necessarily just through a vote on the floor of the House. And we were able to talk through many of those. As many of you have heard, we are going to have Robert Mueller in to testify. And that has taken a long time to do that. We have now issued subpoenas for Don McGahn, for a whole host of people, as well as on issues like family separation. We just did subpoenas on family separation yesterday. And I just think we have to think very hard about how we wake up in the morning and how we go to bed at night and say that we uphold the oath that we were sworn to, which is the Constitution of the United States of America. And there is no question in my mind that this person in the White House has committed multiple offenses that are high crimes and misdemeanors that meet that test. And what we have to do is we have to start to bring that information out, because when Robert Mueller released his report, it was like he was throwing it down the football field, and it was intercepted by Bill Barr, who is not the Attorney General for the United States of America. He's the Attorney General, apparently personal attorney for President Trump. And he intercepted that report, and he lied and misled the American people about what was in it, and the majority of people are not like us, and they haven't read the report. So that is what we need to do now, is make sure we get that information out.
I know we're out of time, but I want to close with those 6 words that I mentioned earlier. Dump Trump, ditch Mitch, save America. And it will depend upon the energy that all of you have to go out this coming year. Obviously, you're not locking yourselves up in your living room with a pillow over your head. You're here. You're ready to fight. The only power that we have to restore America is outside pressure partnered with inside pressure. But we need a Senate in blue hands, as well as a presidency and a Senate that will act with a simple majority to save this country and put it back on track. God bless you all.
Thank you so much. I wish we had more time. I have pages of questions, but so thank you all. And I believe, yep, I don't know where you're going next. But anyway, thank you so much to the members of Congress for coming.